So welcome everyone to today's seminar. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing Anne Oakley to give our seminar on her new book, Forgotten Wives, How Women Get Written Out of History. Anne probably needs no introduction to you all, just for those of you who may not have full information, she's a professor of sociology and social policy at the UCL Social Research Institute. Anne's been researching and writing in the fields of gender, health and methodology since the mid-1960s. Her first book was Sex, Gender and Society in 1972, and her most recent non-fiction work is Forgotten Wives, How Women Get Written Out of History, which she's going to be talking about today. She's also published biography, autobiography and fiction, and accounts of her father, Richard Titmus's work building up the social policy department at LSE. So she's got very close connections with LSE, and that's what she's going to draw out, I think, in her talk today on the characters in her book. So thank you much. Over to you, Anne. So there will be about 40-45 minutes of talk, and then as usual, there'll be the opportunity for questions after that.
Thank you for that introduction. It always makes me feel quite tired when people recite some of the things I've done. Anyway, I am pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it's very nice to see a live audience, which I much prefer to the other sort. But I hope everybody gets something out of what I'm going to say. So, as Lucinda said, I'm going to talk about this book of mine, Forgotten Wives, which was actually published last summer in the middle of a lockdown. It's not a good time to publish a book, but people nevertheless seem to be reading it. The subtitle of the book, which I meant to bring with me and I forgot, the subtitle is How Women Get Written Out of History, but I've given it a new subtitle for today, which is An Alternative History of LSE, because you will gather there are quite a few connections between the case studies in my book and the beginnings and the later development of LSE to the wonderful institution it is today. But the stories in my book, very sadly, do not mostly appear in the standard histories and biographies of LSE, which is, of course, one reason why I wrote the book. So I'm going to cover three things. Firstly, why I wrote it, who it's about, and what this alternative history of LSE looks like. And then I'm going to end with discussing a few methodological problems to do with the writing of biography and history, which were the problems that kind of prompted me into this territory in the first place. So I'm going to begin in a slightly different place with a personal story about my own connection to LSE. And I have written about this somewhere, so if you've read that, forgive me for reading it again. So I first came to LSE 72 years ago. It was in 1950. It was December and it was very cold. And I came all the way on the underground from Ealing Common with my parents. My father, Richard Titmus, had just been appointed to this new professorial post, heading what was then called the Department of Social Administration. And in this capacity, he found himself in charge of a band of female social workers about whom he knew very little. What happened to him and to them, that's another story that I'm not going into today. The person who was director of LSE then in 1950 was a population expert called Alexander Carr-Saunders, and he held a Christmas party every year for the children of LSE staff, and that was why I was brought on the underground to LSE in the cold December. The party was held in a room called the Shaw Library, on the top floor of the main building, this building, and there was a magnificent Christmas tree with a fairy on the top. And every year the fairy was given to one of the children in the room, and I never got the fairy. And the sense of failure has stayed with me in my life. Anyway, the point of the story is not the fairy, it's the name of the room, which many people believe and still believe commemorates the rather peripheral role of the playwright George Bernard Shaw in the founding of LSE. That isn't the case, as I'm sure, I hope that you all know. Shaw Library is named after Charlotte Payne Townsend, who married George Bernard Shaw in 1898, 3 years after LSE opened its doors to the first students. And without her, the school might quite possibly never have got off the ground at all. The Shaw Library also houses the famous stained glass window that depicts members of the Fabian Society. The design of that window is also credited to George Bernard Shaw, although it was actually designed and made by one of the early stained glass women artists, a woman called Caroline Townsend. She was a cousin of Caroline Payne Townsend, and Caroline ran a studio in West London making stained glass. And both Charlotte Payne Townsend, who became Charlotte Shaw, and her cousin Caroline were very active in the Fabian Women's Group, which was set up in 1908 to draw the Fabian Society's attention to their painful and sad neglect of issues to do with the position of women. Fabian, I'm sure you know, the Fabian Group's activities included sponsoring the very famous study of working class families, which was called Roundabout £1 a Week, and was published by Maud Primrose in 1913. So that's some of the context, none of which I knew, obviously, in 1950. I doubt actually whether my father knew the origins of the Shaw Library. And most of this story I didn't discover until I started doing a research for this book. So Charlotte is one of the four. There are 4 case studies in the book, and I'm going to come back to her in a minute. The other 3 case studies in the book are Mary Booth, who was married to Charles Booth, the person who did the big poverty survey of life and labour of the people in London. And the Booths were actually connected to LSE because Beatrice Webb was Mary Booth's cousin. And Beatrice Webb was another person who was extremely important at the beginning of LSE. And the last 2 wives were Jeanette Tawney, who was married to the socialist historian and professor at LSE, R.H. Tawney, and Janet Bedridge, who was married to the so-called founder of the welfare state and the director of LSE for the years from 1919 to 1937, William Beveridge. So Janet Beveridge, the 4th. So the whole of this book is really an exercise in information retrieval. It's a recovering of buried or misinterpreted accounts. There's actually nothing unusual about this kind of methodological exercise these days, but my book focuses on one particular theme, and that is the role of what I call wifehood as ideology in shaping the discrepancies that you find between alternative accounts, either biographies or standard historical narratives. So the ideology of wifehood is something that is both simple and complicated. Simply, it's about how women's secondary status has historically been achieved and also maintained through the institution of marriage as the normative status for adult women. And in relation to this, it's very often forgotten that the earliest feminist struggles were not actually about the vote. We are, I think, quite misled these days by some of the media reruns of suffragettes in hats showing bricks through windows and being chained to railings because they wanted to vote. They did indeed want to vote, that was important. But historically, what that feminist movement and the later one, the one that I was part of in the 1970s, what they were really about was marriage. They were about women's rights to be seen as people independently of the institution of marriage. So women have been historically much more concerned about their inability as wives to have legal custody of their children, to have rights over their own bodies, to own money and property, and have their own nationalities and rights to education and professional work. They've been more concerned about the inequalities that derive from the institution of marriage than they have from the exclusion from political power. In the 1970s, when I joined the Women's Liberation Movement, we had a campaign called Why Be a Wife? And we had little plastic badges, metal badges. YBA. I've still got mine, it's in the drawer. I shall donate it to some historical enterprise somewhere. So the argument of Forgotten Wives is that this marital notion of women being appendages of men has helped to define the way women in general are seen and the ways in which their contributions to the home and outside it are judged. So women are wives, or they are would-be wives, or they are wives to be. Women's conduct is evaluated by standards that derive from the institutionalized inequality that is another name for marriage still today. So the 4 case studies in my book are just a way of illustrating this. I wrote the book, well, because it needed to be written, and because in many years of researching and writing about the lives of female social reformers, I have become increasingly depressed and at times really angry about the ways in which they tend to be sidelined or ignored in standard biographies and histories. My last book on this subject was called Women, Peace and Welfare, and it was published 3 years ago. And that is about more than 300 women who across the world in the period between 1880 and 1920 did a number of things. They were social reformers, they developed the tools of social science, and they played a very important part in the peace movement. So in writing that book, I sometimes felt I was drowning in forgotten women, 300 forgotten women. So for this book, I thought I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to take 4. I'm going to take 4 for whom there is some archival evidence. You know, that should be a manageable project. It wasn't, of course, because I made that decision before finding out what kinds of lives and contributions these women had made. So, you know, it was all, the whole thing was actually rather more unmanageable than I had imagined. Unmanageable in the sense of rich and complicated and subversive. I do like subversive stories. So I'm going to tell you now a bit more about the 3 case studies that are particularly linked to LSE. Mary, Charlotte, Jeanette and Janet were born between 1847 and 1880, and they died between 1939 and 1958. Thus, their lives and work span a really crucial time in British social history. The foundations of the welfare state, the beginnings of emancipation for women, the evolution of our current party political system, the emergence of social science, and of course, the establishment of LSE. The 4 husbands all played an important role in much of this. They all feature prominently in what one might call the origin myths that shape our understanding of how modern Britain evolved. In these origin myths, the wives variously feature as dutiful or neglectful domestic labourers, as helpmeets or obstructors of their husband's work, as modest or domineering personalities, but what they uniformly lack is agency. That wives really do not emerge from existing historical accounts as autonomous individuals with lives and ambitions of their own. These case studies in my book are case studies of white privileged women, and I'm asked often how the argument of the book might be different had I made different choices about case studies. I think part of the answer here is that no women are privileged in relation to men of their social class. None of the 4 women in my book had the same educational opportunities as men of their class or generation. 2 did make it to university, but one of these, Janet Beveridge, married her examiner who forced her to give up her dream of postgraduate work. all of the four women found themselves debarred from professional employment, and all of them suffered from the restrictions that marriage imposed on women's life chances. So restrictions of marriage are dependent for women, are partly dependent on culture. And had I chosen culturally different case studies, details would be different, but I doubt very much whether the central argument about the role of wifehood as ideology would be affected. So I'm going to go back to Charlotte Shaw, or rather begin with her. She's actually the only wife of the four to have had a biography written about her. It's called Mrs. GBS, which proves my point. It was written by somebody who I have not been able to trace, which is a bit of a pity, but she did put her notes for the book in the Shaw archives in LSE, so they can be read. And the outline of this story is that when Charlotte Payne Townsend married Shaw, he was a penniless, virtually unknown playwright. She was a rich Irish heiress with radical ideas. She discovered her mission to advance the prospects of sociology in the autumn 1895, when she met Beatrice and Sidney Webb at a dinner party. As a lot of this is about social networks and who met whom, and dinners and lunches and all of that sort of thing. So at this lunch party, Beatrice Webb, who was always a pragmatist, spotted the fact that the Irish ladies' wealth might be useful to their project of starting a school of economics. In one of his accounts of LSE's origin, Sidney Webb actually put Charlotte first in the list of LSE founders. Sue Donnelly, the LSE archivist, has an excellent web piece about Charlotte, which describes her as, quote, an often overlooked key player, a constant presence in LSE's early home, and a generous donor both of time and money. And I think that is true. But despite this, most accounts of LSE history leave Charlotte Shaw out of the picture. For example, Ralph Garandall's mammoth history of LSE says that two young men founded the School of Economics. In the next paragraph, he acknowledges that various other people helped them, but Charlotte Shaw isn't mentioned in the list. Later on in his book, Charlotte appears in a list of school governors as Mrs. Bernard Shaw, along with Mrs. Sidney Webb. So that's how she appears in that history. LSE began life in very cramped quarters in John Adams Street in the Strand. And within months, it had outgrown this first home, and a house for rent was found in Adelphi Terrace nearby. A 7-year lease was available at £360 a year, but the problem was that this was almost the whole amount of money Sidney Webb had to cover the school's expenses. So Charlotte provided the answer. She paid £300 a year for the 2 upper floors of the building, which she lived in. And LSE started out in the ground floor rooms. And she ran all sorts of little events and occasions for the first students. She moved in sometime in 1896, and she lived there alone above the expanding bustle of LSE until she married George Bernard Shaw. However, this history doesn't prevent the flat being described as George Bernard Shaw's in the histories of the beginnings of LSE. So like the Shaw Library and the stained glass window, the Platt and that building is ascribed to him. As well as being one of LSE's first governors, Charlotte was one of its first trustees. She was a member of the advisory board, which in 1901 applied to the Board of Trade to register the school as a company. So this really is the beginning of LSE. She provided £1,000 with which the LSE library was able to open in November 1896. And over the years, she was, as Sue Donnelly says on her web piece about Charlotte Shaw, she provided money whenever funding was needed. And she provided, clearly, the funds for what became the misunderstood Shaw Library, for which she personally chose the books. Though Beatrice Webb was probably right to spot Charlotte's usefulness as a financial donor, but Charlotte did much more than this for LSE. In 1904, she endowed a Shaw Scholarship or Studentship, which provided funds for research students. The first holder of the studentship was the Fabian housing reformer and later Labour politician Marion Phillips. But after that, the awards from 1906 to 1910 were given to 5 men. Charlotte objected. And she said she stipulated that in future, the studentship in her name must be given to women only, and it should fund work on the social and economic position of women. Indeed, she said, the entire suite of women's history. She wasn't without ambition, this woman. Charlotte was particularly interested, she said, in the historical origins of modern wifehood. She wanted someone to find out how married women's autonomy before the Middle Ages had evolved into the English common law doctrine, which dictates that a wife is always subordinate to her husband. Among the works of scholarship Charlotte Shaw's programme at LSE funded was the work of the historian and later LSE professor Eileen Power. Her Medieval Women was research for that was done with Charlotte Shaw's scholarship money. And another book which I read many years ago, it's still regarded as a pioneering in classic text, and it's the Quaker historian Alice Clark's book called Working Life of Women in the 17th Century. So both of those were written with help from Charlotte Shaw. Charlotte Shaw also did other non-LSE things. She actively promoted and translated the work of a radical French playwright called Eugene Grier, who was a sort of French equivalent of George Bernard Shaw. And he wrote plays about popular subjects, unpopular subjects like venereal disease, abortion, forced marriage. And Charlotte thought these ought to be on the English stage. And she acquired the translation rights, translated them, and then tried to get them on the stage, which was somewhat difficult. Another thing she did was she played a major role in the life and writings of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who approached George Bernard Shaw for an opinion on the manuscripts that would become 7 Pillars of Wisdom. George Bernard Shaw wasn't really interested in this manuscript, and he passed it to Charlotte. And Charlotte basically revised it, rewrote it. And there are hundreds of letters between her and Lawrence, which are in the British Library, which show that she had really a major influence on that work. But you get, as I said, very little sense of any of this from the accounts that exist of George Bernard Shaw's life, although some of it does appear in Mrs. GBS. The most credit Charlotte usually gets is for helping with Shaw's work, doing the research for some of the plays, coming up with the idea for Joan of Arc, choosing actors and arranging performances. In some accounts, she is described as Shaw's typist or his nurse. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography describes her as George Bernard Shaw's informal nurse. Biographers also spend quite a lot of time musing on the tortuous subject of whether or not the Shaws actually had sex. She was over 40 when they married, and she was apparently terrified of childbirth, and they both decided they were not going to have children. Anyway, there's an awful lot of words devoted to the subject of what actually went on in the bedroom. Most people decide that they probably didn't have sex and that was her fault, and it explains and justifies George Bernard Shaw's habit of pursuing other women. I say no more. But it is noted that Charlotte did take excellent care of George Bernard Shaw the way a wife is supposed to do. For example, in that early LSE establishment, she turned over one of the rooms on the top floor to be a study for him, with a desk for him and a desk for his secretary, which she wasn't. And she, wherever they went in the world, she made sure that he had access to the vegetarian food, which he liked to eat, which was unusual at the time. But she had a menu that she handed out in restaurants and hotels. This is what my husband will eat. So she gets approval from biographers for being a good wife. The next wife does not do that at all. Jeanette Tawney is universally criticised by biographers of R.H. Tawney for being a bad wife. One of Jeanette's problems, and this was reflected in an obituary that was written of her by the Labour MP Lena Yeager, was that she was seen as either Tawney's wife or William Beveridge's sister, or both, rather than as a person in her own right. She was, Jeanette Tawney, I told you, this is very complicated about social networks. Jeanette Tawney was William Beveridge's sister. And she married, when she married R.H. Tawney, she married William Beveridge's best friend at Oxford. So this is a network, this is a closed, small circle. The Tawneys got married after a very long and very fraught courtship that was not tolerated by the Beveridge parents, who saw academic life as an unsuitable and financially disastrous occupation. And yes, they were right about that, perhaps. One confused historian actually describes Jeanette Tawney as Tawney's sister and Beveridge's wife. I think the wrong way around, okay? Again, proves my point. But, as long as you can attach the woman to one man, or preferably two, then you kind of disposed of her. So what is she condemned for? She is condemned by biographers of both Tawney and LSE for her disreputable behaviour as a wife. She is held to account for the untidy and even positively dirty circumstances in which the Tawneys lived, for her tendency to wear unsuitable clothes and to say unsuitable things, for not supporting her husband's work enough, and for spending too much of his money. Kingsley Martin, the editor of the New Statesman, said that R.H. Tawney wrote about the Inquisitive Society. That was one of his books published in 1920. So Martin said, R.H. Tawney wrote about the Inquisitive Society and Mrs. Tawney illustrated it. That was his only reference to her. Jeanette Tawney died in 1958, but Tawney lived another 4 years, and there's another sort of personal tale attached to that. During these last 4 years of Tawney's life, he was a regular visitor to my childhood home. Tawney and my father were colleagues at LSE, and my father very much admired Tawney's Equality. That was published in the early 1930s, and it made a strong moral case for socialism. So I remember Tawney. I remember him as a very untidy man who smoked yellow coltsfoot tobacco in a pipe, which he emptied into the cuff of his trousers and onto my mother's clean carpet. I remember the smell, terrible smell. I don't know. I thought it was the tobacco, but now I think it was probably Tawney himself. And so it appears when I got into the Tawney archives at LSE that the lack of hygiene in the Tawney homes, rather than being caused by Mrs. Tawney, came from Tawney himself. And it was a source of displeasure to his wife and the cause of great tension in the Tawney marriage. Here is Jeanette writing to her husband 2 years after they married in 1911. I know you don't really mean to improve your dirty habits, and I know too that I never can be quite happy with a man who despises cleanliness and doesn't care if he vexes me with regard to it or not, she said. I feel ashamed of going anywhere with you, as I know you were always so slovenly, and I know that people rightly judge a man's principles by his practice. It is rather absurd to keep preaching social reform and better conditions when you, possessing them, still prefer to be dirty. I don't believe you realise how I look at these things, and I don't see why I should be made to conform entirely to your way of life. You point out often that women should be free, etc., and yet you ask your wife to live with you when you are a regular slut. Point. So Chorley was not a very good husband. That insight is buried behind biographers' condemnation of Jeanette for being a bad wife. I think the biographers of Chorley obviously didn't read the same part of the archives that I did, which is a key methodological point. Jeanette's work is uniformly ignored in accounts of Chorley's life, as is her occupation as one of the first women factory inspectors and the writer of both autobiography and fiction. The LSE archives show that she was a historian in her own right. She published work on women and unemployment, the history of occupational statistics, and the development of economic ideas. She collaborated in research with her husband. And one of her enterprises, this I found quite interesting, one of the things she did was to edit a volume of extracts from the 17th century English Puritan Richard Baxter's Christian Directory. So she edited a volume of extracts which she published in 1925. And the significance of Baxter's writings is that they are widely thought to have been a major inspiration for sociological treatises about Protestantism and capitalism, including that by Max Weber, and almost certainly Chorley's own Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, which was published the year after Jeanette did the Baxter extracts. So that's Jeanette Chorley. Well, it's a bit about Jeanette Chorley. So now to the third of my LSE related case studies, Janet Beveridge. So like Charlotte Shaw, Janet had a really profound influence on the evolution of LSE, though hers was later than Charlotte's. She came to work at LSE in 1919. She was then known as Jessie Mayer. She was married to William Beveridge's cousin, David Mayer, at the time. So Jessie came to work at LSE as its secretary, which was a powerful administrative and even academic position. And she came from a background in the civil service. She'd been a senior civil servant in the First World War, working in the Ministry of Food, where she had responsibility for bacon rationing. She pointed out in one of her biographical accounts that when she got the job in the Ministry of Food, the press had a good time greeting the appointment with headlines proclaiming that here at last was a woman in charge of the nation's larder. So she was famous for bacon rationing before she was famous for LSE, or rather infamous. So at LSE, she joined William Beveridge, who'd just been recruited by Sidney Webb to replace the New Zealand politician William Pember-Reeve, who was the husband of Lord Pember-Reeve, who I mentioned earlier, connected social networks again. William Beveridge and Janet occupied these two roles of director and secretary at LSE for 18 years during a period which became known as the second foundation of LSE. And it was a period that saw the school expand enormously in terms of student numbers, wealth, buildings, and reputation. And it was this whole expansion was very much a joint achievement. But Janet Beveridge, like Jeanette Chorley, is a bit of a problem for biographers because it doesn't fit the stereotype of a good wife. In the first place, she didn't actually marry William Beveridge until 2 weeks after the Beveridge report was published, after he'd left LSE. And for the whole period when they worked together at LSE, she was married to his cousin. And this was an arrangement that gave rise to a lot of unkind, nosy speculation about the nature of the relationship. And I believe there was a room somewhere here on this floor that was hers and which had a bed in it, and that didn't improve the quality of the gossip about their relationship. So the point about Janet's job at the school as secretary at LSE was that she, it's very clear from the archives that she was a woman who was very much given to expressing her own opinion, to expressing her opinions and being assertive in her relations with the academic staff, many of whom took exception to being told what to do by a woman. I mean, this is a long time ago. This sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. So how did she contribute to the development of LSE? When she joined William Beveridge, the place was literally bursting into seams. The student population had doubled since the war, and teaching took place in disused army hubs. There were only 3 full-time teachers, only a few lecture rooms, few graduate students or research facilities, and a very small library. And it was during the reign of Janet and William at LSE that the school gained the world famous address in Horton Street that it has today. Among the Beveridge papers in the library here are a few pages by Janet, written in 1958, headed "The Near Loss of Horton Street." These record what's happened for LSE to occupy this site. The start was made with a derelict public house, the Red Lion pub, which was purchased by the school in 1919. And then a few weeks after Janet came here, she negotiated with the London County Council to demolish the pub. And then she used her connections and her ingenuity to get £45,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time, out of the University Grants Committee to provide the cost, cover the cost of a new building. But that was only the beginning of the solution, because a large publishing company was competing for the Horton Street space. And this problem was only solved when Janet managed to talk directly to the Board of Education's legal advisor, with the result that the LCC signed a compulsory requisition order for the houses, which had to go before LSE could be built. So she is responsible for this building. Among her other achievements were bringing the school's administrative systems into the modern age, introducing new procedures for student admissions, starting a modern languages department, and a course for students taking civil service examinations, and introducing a superannuation scheme for all staff, including the porters. That was very unusual at the time. LSE was also the first higher education institution in the UK to have a family allowance scheme for staff. Every member of staff who had children between 13 and 23 in education got an extra £30 a year. And this was, Janet was a follower of Eleanor Rathbone and her scheme for family allowances. So that's where this idea came from, but she actually put it into practice. To Janet, you also owe the LSE motto, Rerum Cognoscere Causis. She thought the place ought to have a motto. And in 1922, she offered a guinea to any student who would come up with good suggestion. And I like to say that a student did, but it wasn't the student. It was the economist Edwin Cannon, who retrieved a successful entry from some Latin book. And that's why, but it was Janet's idea. Another important aspect of Janet's role at LSE was her part in a dense and completely forgotten subplot about an attempt to replace LSE's armchair theorising, which it had become rather well known for in the 1920s, to replace that with a more empirically based social science. This plot involves the Rockefeller Foundation. So LSE's massive growth in these years, in the 1920s and early 30s, were largely financed with Rockefeller money, for which Janet did much of the negotiating, persuading, and planning. And it was Rockefeller money that Tawney, R.H. Tawney, relied on to support his research for religion and the rise of capitalism, and that he and Eileen Power used for their work on Tudor economic documents. It was Rockefeller money which funded the anthropologist Malinowski's chair in social anthropology and Lionel Robbins' chair in political economy. Robbins and most of the senior economists at LSE drew on Rockefeller money to hire teaching assistants and finance their publications. And there were other works on poverty and the gold standard and a repeat of the Charles Booth social survey were all funded with Rockefeller money. But one of the controversial things that the Rockefeller money enabled LSE to do was to set up a department of social biology. And this was actually very productive. It sponsored a lot of important studies of population, heredity, and environment. And it was also responsible for inventing the pregnancy test, which involves injecting frogs, with women's urine. This was the pregnancy test that was used worldwide for about 30 years until the early 1960s, and it was invented here. But this emphasis on experiment, observation, and number crunching, and the vision the Department of Social Biology rested on of a union between social and natural science was not a welcome message for some of the senior economists, particularly at LSE, who preferred their version of social science as something that you did sitting in a chair and talking. It didn't help. Some of the professors were turfed out of their rooms in order to make space for the laboratories, and the housing required for 1,500 experimental animals. So if this is giving you a new version of LSE, it's a kind of mini zoo. That was exactly what happened to me when I was reading all of this stuff. Anyway, it wasn't a success, and that's another story. And just before we leave Janet Beveridge, there is a little matter of the Beveridge report. When William Beveridge was first asked to chair a commission looking at the whole social insurance system and to provide some ideas about where it might go, he wasn't very keen on the idea, and it was Janet who persuaded him. And he said, in one of his accounts of their work together, he said Janet was as much to blame for the making of the Beveridge report as I was. It was a partnership of two that devised social security for Britain and set an example to the world. Janet encouraged William to lay down long-term goals in many areas and not to get stuck on the sort of technical statistical detail. And as one historian has concluded, quote, the Beveridge report could so easily have offered all the excitement of a garden marrow rather than the striking bloom it turned out to be. Left to Beveridge, the report would probably have been consigned to the kitchen garden. Well, I don't know how much of all that you knew. I didn't know very much of it until I got into the archives. I had read Josie Harris's biography of William Beveridge, which criticizes Janet, calls her formidable, bossy, domineering, self-centered, insecure, histrionic, dictatorial, judgmental, a wicked woman, and Beveridge's bad angel, a woman who destroyed his chances of personal happiness and did untold harm to his professional life. That is the picture of Janet Beveridge that emerges in that biography. Interestingly, William's own account of Janet's role at LSE and the quote I read you about what he said about her part in the Beveridge report, in all of these accounts, he really emphasizes what she contributed, but Josie Harris rejects that. He rejects his vision as deluded. She says he was deluded about her contribution. And there's a kind of Chinese whisper involved here, whereby one account gets taken up and amplified in others. So Harris's biography of Beveridge is the source from most other historical accounts, including Darendorf's History of LSE and Maxine Berg's biography of Eileen Power. They both repeat this kind of mantra of Janet Beveridge being the thorn in the whole kind of Beveridge LSE story. So just to try and bring all this together, I want to say a little bit about methodology. It may be obvious by now. My argument is that when they have to deal with a wife's presence in a great man's life, biographers tend to fall back on presumptions that whatever she did, it couldn't have been much. Just a bit of wifely labour with perhaps a little philanthropy or writing on the side. Whereas biographers, I think, should deal with the question of wifely labour in a fair-minded and evidence-based way. What did she actually do for or with him? Would he have been able to do what he did without her? As agents of their own lives, what did women do or want to do? And what might they have been prevented from doing? It is so incredibly important that wives' domestic work isn't commented on when it's done, it's just taken for granted. Only when it isn't done, as apparently was the case with Jeanette Dorney, do you get attention, you get the spotlight thrown on the fact that there is a great deal of labour going on in the private space of the home. So this whole issue of gender as domestic labour is central to Forgotten Wives. And I come back time and time again to what, in the great man view of history, the great men would have been able to do without this kind of support. You know, the wife at home looking after the great man, cooking the meals, looking after the children. Of these four wives, only Janet Beveridge and Mary Booth had children, and Janet had 4 children with her first husband. Mary Booth had 7 children, and she reared 6 of them successfully to adulthood, which was very unusual at the time. And her achievements as a mother and as a domestic labourer get very, very little comment. So I did have some very valuable help from family members for 2 of the Forgotten Wives in my book, for Mary Booth and for Janet Beveridge. I tracked down relatives and talked to them, and that was amazingly interesting and valuable. But other than that, all of it is drawn from publicly available material. It comes from books, published articles, from archive materials, which are available for anyone to look at. I think, I mean, there is a general methodological lesson here about which archives do you read? How do you decide which archives to read? Do you read one half of the correspondence? Why do you only read one half? Why do you read the letters that, you know, he wrote to her, but not the letters she wrote to him? There are thousands of Booth letters in the Senate House Library, and I think most of the ones that Mary Booth wrote have not been read. And as far as I could tell, she kept her diaries. Mary Booth wrote a diary every year, amazing account of record of everything. They have not really been used very much by people who wanted to find out about Charles Booth. If you look at the very scanty textbooks and advice literature about how to do archival research, there's very, very little guide there about what you should do. You're given a sort of you know, the advice is read as widely as you can, have a good time, one of them says, formulate a research question, that would be helpful. But there's very little guidance about how to choose what you read, how to interpret what you read, how to situate what you read in other histories and contexts and so on. Archival research is actually a form of ethnography, but as such, it doesn't really seem to have caught up with the enormous strides that have been made in accounts of how to do ethnographic work that we have been able to read in the last 20, 30 years. You know, we now have accounts of how to develop criteria to evaluate qualitative research data, but we don't have any such account of how to evaluate the data that you get from the reading of archival material. So I was disappointed not to be able to find a guide as to how I was to make sense of all of this. And I do hope that this issue of methodology will get some serious attention in future. Okay, finally, I would just like to end with a note of thanks to the fund at LSE, which has supported my work on Forgotten Wives and on women and social reform for a number of years. The Titmuss Meinhardt Fund was set up following my father's death in 1973, but it got its major injection of money from the will of a German economist called Mari Meinhardt, who did research at LSE in the 1930s as a refugee from the Nazis. I knew Mari as a child, And one day, in whatever year it was, I had a phone call from LSE saying, did I know the name of Mary Meinhardt? Because she had left a house in Switzerland and a Pizarro painting to LSE. So I said, yes, I did know Mary Meinhardt. And I think she was, in a way, another forgotten wife, but I think she would be pleased that her bequest to LSE has borne fruit in the discovery of some of these histories, some of these buried stories. So I would like to thank her and you.
Thanks very much indeed, Anne. That's fascinating. It's a bit depressing. And I don't know any of it. I don't know about others. We have some time for questions. Who would like? I will look out for hands on the screen or in the room. So we have Stephen who'd like to ask a question.
That's wonderful, thank you. I was intrigued by the differences between your account about Beveridge and Josie Harris's in the role of the wife in this particular case. And having read the Harris book, albeit many years ago, I'm just amazed that how did you come to that view when you come to a different one? Is this related to your methodological remarks at the end, or was there something personal going on, or?
I don't know. There were actually two editions of the Harris biography. The second edition, which was the part about Janet, was revised between the first and second edition, and it was revised as a result of Janet Beveridge's son, Philip Mayer, publishing a book which attempted to put the record straight. And it attempted to say, you know, look, my mother wasn't like this. She did actually do some useful things. And Josie Harris tries to take account of this, but actually doesn't change her view particularly. I don't know. Some of the key documents, it's quite a difficult area for me. I did get in touch with Josie and I did try and talk to her about this. And I did ask her some of the footnotes, some of the references I were for material which I was unable to find here, and the archivist couldn't find it. And Josie Harris said she thought it might be in her house somewhere, that she wasn't able to find it. I don't know. To me, it reads that very much that she just followed the kind of party line. She followed what other people said, some other people said about Janet Beveridge. And she did, I don't know whether she had a personal axe to grind, but you know, it's she didn't, I think, ask herself the question, what was this person really like? How do I know? Yeah. Don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So we have a question from behind you, from Lady Mirabah. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk, and the book is really fascinating. So I've already managed to get like half through, but I wondered, in the book you mentioned a little bit about the fact that, you know, these women all wrote essays, wrote a variety of different opinion pieces, and actually they tried to write novels, but
yes,
all four of them failed. And you know, this was really fascinating to me as well. I mean, you and I guess to you as well, as a novelist and biographer. Yes. And I wonder if you can expand a little bit more about that. You know, Mary Booth destroys hers. You know, the others, so I have theirs abstracted from being published, and only fragments remain. So, you know, what's your sense, like, because this is a story that's kind of unites these four.
I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to say something about that, but I decided there wasn't time. It is perfectly true. Mary Booth wrote a novel which she burnt. We know she burnt it because there's an entry in her diary saying that, but we don't know any more than that. But there are writings by Mary Booth in the Booth archives, other kinds of writing. And Janet Beveridge did write a novel, and she was about to sign a very lucrative contract with an American publisher for that novel and for another non-fiction work, when she wrote to the publisher and said, actually, no, my husband doesn't want me to. So this was the only respect in which I could fault William as a supportive husband. He was not supportive of Janet's desire to go into print, and I don't know why. The parts of Janet's novel exist in the Beveridge archive, and Jeanette Tawney spent quite a lot of her life trying to write fiction. She had a long correspondence with the novelist Storm Jameson about how you write a novel, and Storm did work quite intensively with her on various drafts. But Jeanette never even told her husband that she was writing a novel. She said he wouldn't be interested and he wouldn't, she didn't want him to know, really. So, yes, the role of fiction writing in wives' lives, I think that's a subject for a PhD or another book. I'm not into writing, but there's clearly something important about being able to tell a story which is actually, I think, as these were, veiled accounts of one's own life, of the issues that you were grappling with, actually, and to say this is fiction, so it's safe, it's fiction. And there is a whole tradition. I was amazed when I wrote the earlier book, Women, Peace and Welfare, how many women reformers and some of the early women in social sciences wrote fiction. I mean, they published fiction. There was a woman called Margaret Harkness, who was another cousin of Beatrice Wood. She had a lot of cousins. And Margaret Harkness published novels under the name John Law, and under her own name. So, and these were social realism novels. They were novels that were actually dealing with issues to do with social conditions and poverty that Margaret Harkness was writing about in her non-fiction work. So she was dealing with these themes in both a fictional and a non-fictional way at the same time. And that was very common. And I think, partly some women did it to make money. Not that Janet Beveridge was able to make any money out of her idea, but she would have done, she could have done. Yeah, very important.
Thank you. So we have Correcta and then we have Anne. So
thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's really fascinating. And I had a methodological question. I've recently just started working with a modern historian, and I ask her lots of questions about what the method of doing history is. And I find it really hard to understand the answers. And one of the things that she talks about is not only listening to the voices of the archives, but listening to the silences, which seems to me to be, really very, very powerful. But I wonder if in what you did, you talked about the challenges of kind of thinking through how to interpret what you found.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how you actually go about doing that beyond effectively kind of summarising, what you find. I wonder what the kind of interpretive and analytical elements are, and I don't know if you could say anything about that.
Well, I could say a lot about that, or a little. I think every account that is written of anything has an element of the person who is writing it in it. So my interpretation of this material is probably different from another person's interpretation. But what I think it's important to do is, first of all, you were right about the silences. So I have noticed that some of Mary Booth's diaries are not there in the crucial period of her early marriage to Charles Booth, when they were not getting on. Those diaries seem to have been destroyed. Well, they're not in Saanich House, and none of the surviving relatives. I had them actually going into their attics to look. They couldn't find them, but I have noted that those diaries are not there. I mean, in the book somewhere in the footnote it says we don't know what happened in these years, and there were other places where it was obvious that there was a chunk of something missing, and you don't know why. You don't know why it's not there, but it's important to recall that it isn't there, and that this absence, this silence, may be significant in some way. I tell you, it has made me think very carefully about my own archives, which are going to the British Library, and I've put most of them there already, because I want to be alive to help them catalogue them and say what's here and what isn't here, and what this means and what this doesn't mean. Just in case somebody wants to come along and use this, is mainly research material. If somebody wants to come along and look at it later. So I think you just have to be as honest as you can and as open as you can about what you looked at and why you decided what you did. I mean, I don't know what other people feel reading, but when I first read the Josie Harris biography, I was absolutely astounded. I mean, it just seemed as though she just didn't like Janet Beveridge. I mean, I didn't like Janet Beveridge very much either, but at least I could see that here was somebody who did have a life of her own and was doing interesting things. You don't have to like people in order to acknowledge, what they've done.
Unless they're women. Thank you. So, Anne.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. And I very much enjoyed your presentation. It was really, I just wondered if there's anything more about Janet Beveridge, because it does seem so anomalous what Josie Harris said and the mismatch that there is. I have others written about her at all, because it sounds as though she had a really significant role that has really not been acknowledged at all and ought to be.
Yes.
So that was all really, whether anything more has been done.
Right. What should I do about it? What more can I do about it? It's quite funny. One of my granddaughters was at LSE in the Department of Social Policy a few years ago, and she got the Janet Beveridge Prize. And she said to me, "Who is Janet Beveridge?" So I was able to tell her. I don't know. What more? Have you got any ideas?
Well, I suppose write more about what she did and make it, and it was specific reference to what he did. So I suppose perhaps linking the two together more, because it just really sounds as though she's not going to get credit for what she did. Whether she's a likable person or not is a non-issue.
Yes, it is.
So it's just really that. I mean, I haven't got any other thoughts other than that, really, but it does seem to be that she's very hidden, and I think it's very unfortunate.
Yes. Yeah. Well, maybe there's a case to be made for taking her out and, me writing something kind of separately about her and LSE and
I think that would be definitely worth thinking about, because it would lead to a slightly different interpretation of his role. And I think that's quite important, because he is very prominent in the field. Yes. Historically, it's very prominent, and it sounds as though it's not just him, regardless of what Josie Harris says, because I don't think from what you said that there's much of a basis to support what she said.
Well, I mean, people like some of the old economists here didn't like Janet Beveridge, and they said so. Yeah, and you could read all these letters.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
exactly.
They didn't like being told what to do, and they particularly didn't like the vision which she did have. I mean, she was she was in her own way an intellectual. She and William shared this vision of a social science that was more akin to natural science. And the senior people at LSE didn't like this notion. And they had, in other words, they had a variety of reasons for not getting on with her, which coloured the accounts they gave of her and her role at LSE. Yeah.
I think that's important.
Thank you. So you want a second question, Lucy?
Yeah, right. So
Yeah. I've got one, but I'll let you go.
Good. No, you go. I just think it's going to start campaigning. Let's change the Shaw Room name to Charlotte Shaw.
Yes, that would be a good idea.
I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
never knew this.
You didn't?
Or never.
You didn't know it?
Never heard of this woman.
Good God. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I have a couple of questions if I may. So going back a bit, so one is related to a similar sort of issue about the methodology, and I mean we have all these discussions about replicability in the social sciences, and it seems like the bits that you say you contacted Josie Harris, and the bits that she was using couldn't be found. And
No. And I didn't get, and she wasn't very well at the time, and I talked to Platt, another historian, about this. I decided I just couldn't go any further.
No.
You know, I mean, I did try.
Yeah. But there's I mean, talking about methodology, if things can't be sourced that are in, then that's a sort of a bit of a flag, isn't it?
Yes. But I have no idea what happened to those materials. I'm not suggesting it was a conspiracy. No. And indeed, when you're writing a biography of someone like William Beveridge, you have to read an enormous amount of stuff. And the whole thing becomes probably quite unmanageable. And it was, in any case, quite a long time ago. So, I can't remember some of the things that I read about something that I was writing 20, 30 years ago.
So I wasn't suggesting it could be just, it makes it more problematic for sort of revisiting the narrative.
Which is why this business of these bloody footnotes is really important.
My second question was so that there was when you were talking about Charlotte Payne Townsend and that she didn't want children, or that she was scared, whichever it was, it amounts to the same thing. And you're thinking that sometimes when you're looking at women who've had quite an influence, it's either they haven't been married, so they haven't been tied into this wife ideology, or they have been married but they haven't had children, so they've had less domestic responsibility. But then that doesn't work with you said that Janet Beveridge had 4 children, I think you said. So was there something which made her able to somehow do what she did and be a mother?
She was a very energetic person.
Yeah.
She was, yes, no, when she had those 4 children, she was living the life of a suburban housewife in Surrey, and she said it was so boring. And she wanted to get on and do something else. But it was the war, see, that was what the First World War gave her chance.
So she had to be.
She had to, and she worked with William Beveridge in the Ministry of Food before they came to LSE. And William Beveridge was David Mayer, her first husband's cousin, so he was a frequent visitor to the house. And David Mayer, the first husband, was clearly rather a sort of isolated person. He was very solitary, and he seemed to be very happy for him and for William and Janet to do a lot of things together. It looks like a perfectly amicable, I'm sure there were tensions underneath, but so I think, like lots of women, it was the chance of doing something useful and productive in the conventional sense during the war, which enabled her to get into a professional life. But she was, as I said, she just come over as extremely, she's the kind of person when you read about them, you feel tired. Yeah, she makes me feel tired.
Yes, it's
Jeanette Torley doesn't make me feel quite so tired.
So sorry, you've got Isabel.
Thanks. That was fascinating, of course. I was just wondering from your own lived experience of these stories, obviously you grew up hearing about LSE and its grand figures and so on, whether wives were always invisible figures or whether you felt that sometimes not. Did any of these women ever feature as being more than just
I can't hear with the mask and
I'll take it down.
yes, yes.
So I was just fascinated to know, in terms of your own lived experience
Yes.
of LSE and growing up
Yeah,
hearing stories about the eminent figures in LSE's history, whether these women or indeed other women ever featured as more than just invisible wives, worse, whether actually, you know, sometimes they did stand out in terms of their contributions to the school and so on.
Don't know. I mean, when I was growing up, which I had written about in one other book, I really thought that my father worked in a place that was completely full of social workers and nothing else. And about whom he complained every night when he came back to Ealing Common. He didn't understand them and what they were trying to do. I do remember as a child thinking, but what are they actually doing? You know, he's complaining about them, but they must be doing something for him to be complaining about. And I was very, very, very surprised to discover, you know, what social work at LSE in the 1950s actually meant. I didn't know. Yes, I mean there was a tradition of female work and influence at LSE, which was not belittled. But the emphasis changed. The emphasis changed in the 60s and 70s, as it actually did in other universities as well.
When did the first women faculty begin?
What?
Sorry, when did the first women faculty arrive in LSE in significant numbers? You know?
Well, it depends what you mean by faculty. You know, when I looked at the kinds of contracts these women had, they had temporary contracts, most of them.
Yeah.
Even part-time. Do they qualify as faculty if they're
You're answering my question.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. The current problem that. Yeah.
So, do you have any other questions you would like to ask for a few minutes if you just too stunned or too angry? Yes. So what's next?
Oh, I'm. There is something next. Yeah. I am researching a book which will be called The Science of Housework. One of my first books was called The Sociology of Housework. So The Science of Housework, is about an extraordinary historical moment in the history of the University of London and various other places, including the University of Chicago, when it was possible to take a degree in household and social science. And in London, the King's College of Household and Social Science was an independent part of the University of London in 1928. You could do an honours degree in household science. So you learned social science, but you learned bacteriology, public health, botany, chemistry, physics. And then you knew everything about how to keep the world clean. So it was part of a sort of public health movement. It was it originated in discovery of how unhealthy the population was, the report on the physical deterioration of population. All right, so where do we start to prevent this? We prevent it in the home. It was not really about sending women home to be good housewives. It was about the science of housework. It was about the importance to the public health of cleanliness at home and good nutrition and all of that. So that
footnote, New Zealand footnote.
Yes.
My mother was one of the first graduates in something called domestic science.
Oh, yes,
at
and
the
that was,
University of Otago.
yes, I was going to say it was the University of Otago. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it was
She's still
happening.
alive if you want to talk to her.
I will, yeah. All right, so it was, you know, it was happening all over the place. But this degree in London, I think, was the first one. So that's why. So I'm working in archives in King's College in Strand. You see, I love burying myself in archives, as you can probably tell.
You're not going to write a guide to how to do archival research, then?
Well, somebody's got to do it. Yeah, yeah, yes, they have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think you'll find that fascinating yes, a bit chastening. It's great to hear about it and you know about the book, you know how to get hold of it, so we'll read it now, I think, and think about how we recognise it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.